Hello. If you're watching this video, it's probably because you're interested in knowing how confident we are in the New Testament text. And there's a few statistics that are sometimes thrown out, and they're regarding the New Testament text. Some people say we're only 34.5% confident in the New Testament text. Other people say we're 62.9% confident in the New Testament text. Other people will say we're 99.5% confident in the New Testament text. Well, which is it? Let's take a look at each of these percentages and see how people come up with these numbers. So, why are we only 34.5% confident in the New Testament text? Well, we start out noting that there are about 400,000 variants that are associated with the Greek New Testament. 400,000 basically differences between manuscripts. That's a lot. And it's a lot, especially when you consider the fact that there are only 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament. That means that we have more variants than we actually have words. In fact, it's roughly 2.9 variants per word. So, the probability that any given word in the Greek New Testament being correct is 1 in 2.9, right? Which would be about 34.5%. Sounds reasonable, but wrong. So why not 34.5%? Well, saying that we are only 34.5% confident about the Greek New Testament would be the same as assuming that all of these 400,000 variants are equally likely to be authentic. But they're not. In particular, most of the variants are spelling and nonsense errors. These are very easy to correct and usually do not significantly affect the meaning. They're pretty easy to account for. The second largest group are minor changes which do not affect translation. For example, there are 16 ways to say Jesus loves John in Koine Greek. Order doesn't matter. Sometimes there's multiple ways to say this exact same thing. It all means the same thing. It does not really affect translation to any significant degree. But since they're arranged differently, it counts as a variant, even though it doesn't have any significant impact on meaning. The third largest category are those that are meaningful but not viable. That is, they make sense, but they come so late in the manuscript history that there's no way that they could have been the original. Just as you have two options that are given to you in the pictures here, and if you're going to ask which one is a better representation of the original, it shouldn't be too hard for you to figure it out. These also are a pretty easy category to come to a decision on. The smallest category of variants are those that are meaningful and viable. That is, they actually do impact the meaning, and they also come early enough in the manuscript history that it's possible that they could be authentic, and these are the ones that you actually have to worry about. So, how do we hone in on the meaningful and viable variants? How do we actually take a look at the ones that we want to look at? Well, maybe that's where the 62.9% statistic that people throw out there comes from. So let's see if this works. Okay, so how do they come up with the 62.9% statistic? Well, between major printed editions of the Greek New Testament, roughly 4,999 verses are the same. That is, there aren't any significant changes in the printed editions for these verses. Now, there are about 7,947 total verses which consistently occur in the printed editions. So, comparing the 4,999 verses that are the same to the 7,947 total, you wind up with 62.9%. So people say, hey, the Greek New Testament is 62.9% reliable. Does that make sense? Nope. As if. Why not? Why not go with the 62.9%? Well, there's some assumptions that go into it. this is a verse-by-verse comparison. So if we're comparing the number of verses that are the same compared to the number of verses that have differences, one of the fundamental assumptions that you're making is that all verses are the same size. Is that true? Nope. Next assumption that goes into it. Does a variant necessarily affect the whole verse? That is, just because a verse happens to differ in one edition versus another one, does that mean that the whole verse is differing, or is it just part of it? Is it a domino effect that's going to wipe out the whole thing if one word is different, or one part is different? Or does one part not affect the other? Well, most of the time variants do not affect one another. It's not the case that one variant will affect the whole verse. So that's a faulty assumption as well. Last of all, did the compilers of all the editions have the same information available to them? That is, the decisions that they made, is it all based on the same information? Or did some of them come to bad conclusions because they had bad information? For example, some of the earliest texts that were put out, generally called the Textus Receptus, associated with a lot of the older translations of the Bible, they were only based on a dozen or two Greek manuscripts. Later Greek and New Testaments, though, are based on considerably more. Right now we have about 5,700 Greek manuscripts that we know of. Is it fair to say that all of these people still would have made the same decisions, even though not all of them had the same information available to them? Well, no, that's not a reasonable assumption either. So maybe the 99.5% is correct. Maybe that's the one that'll actually work for us. Here's hoping. Nope. No, this one doesn't work either. Why not? Why doesn't the 99.5% work? Well, the problem is that nobody seems to know how this percentage was calculated. It's quoted very often. And people like to throw this number out there. The only problem is if you ask them how they got to this number of 99.5%, a lot of them are left there scratching their heads. It's a statistic that they like to throw out there. It's kind of a mystery box that they like to bring with them, but they don't like to open it because they have no idea what's inside. They don't know how to come up with this number. So, how confident can we be in the New Testament text? If all of these percentages that are normally quoted are wrong, well, what are we going to do? This is where a particular resource comes in handy for us. It's called the UBS 5. That is the United Bible Society's 5th edition of the Greek New Testament. It was made by a bunch of scholars. Scholars would see people who read a lot of books, kind of scary. Yeah, those people. They got together and they put together a text that has some very important features. Using this text, the UBS 5, we can say that there are about 1,407 points of notable variation. That is, we're not counting the nonsense kinds of errors. We're not counting the spelling errors. We're not counting the word order changes. We're not counting all that stuff that doesn't really affect the meaning and doesn't affect translation. We're just worried about the stuff that helps us establish the text and is meaningful for translation. And it turns out that there's about 1,407 points in which this occurs, and the total number of words associated with all these points of variation are about 6,355. What's more is that the scholars were nice enough to rank them for us. That is, if they were really confident about the choice that they made in the text, they marked it as an A. A little bit less confident, a B. Not quite so much, but still pretty good, a C. Not very confident, but they were still able to make a decision, a D. And then if they weren't able to make a decision, it was basically a 50-50 toss-up between two options, then that they labeled with a diamond. It didn't get a letter, because it didn't get a passing grade, basically. It's just basically a 50-50 split. So we can use these. We'll use 95% for the A's, we'll use 85% for the B's, 75% for the C's, 65% for the D's, and 50% for the diamonds, because those are basically a 50-50 split. Basic will say that, if they ranked a variant as an A, we'll give it an A average grade. As a B, we'll give it a B average grade. This allows us to say how many of the words they probably got correct. So we can go through and we can actually analyze this. Alright, so here's a table, and this is what we're going to start with. We're going to start with the rank down the left-hand side. How confident we actually are regarding these things. Now let's go ahead and actually see how many words are associated with each one of these ranks. Well, the smallest category is the diamonds. That is the places where they really couldn't come to a definitive decision. It was basically a 50-50 toss-up. That happened with 35 words. The Ds, those were, they can make a choice, but they're not really confident about it. That happened with 38 words. Places where they could make a decision, but it was fairly tough. That happened with 1,297 words. Where they're pretty sure of their answer, 1,972 words. And where they're confident, with the variance, 3,013 words. So, the upper portion, A, B, C, D, and the diamond, that makes up the 6,355 words worth of variance that are at issue here. And that leaves, out of the total of 138,162, that leaves about 131,807 words that are not significantly affected by the variance at all. So now let's look at this and actually see what probability they actually got correct. This is pretty easy to do. You just take the decimal times the number of words in that category, the decimal for that category, the number of words in that category, multiply them together, and this is what you get. Of the diamond words, the ones where it could be a kind of a 50-50 toss-up, well, they got, of course, we would say that they probably got about half of them right, 17.5. For the D words, a little bit larger proportion, they probably got about 24.7 out of the 38 correct. For the C words, 972.75 out of the 1,297 words. And on down the list goes. So that by the time you're all said and done, you have about 137,360.5 words that are probably correct, out of a total of 138,162. So as a percentage, what does this come to? 99.4%. And the number of words that are probably correct versus the total number comes out to 99.4%. So, finally, we can say that we are 99.4% confident that the New Testament represented by the UVS 5 represents the text which it attempts to reconstruct. So that's your answer, folks. How confident are we? 99.4. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope this has been instructive. Catch you later, folks.